Kia ora, good morning. Welcome to Winning the Green Premium, our webinar series for New Zealand's sustainable food and fibre exporters, brought to you by the Value Project and New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. Tēnā koutou, tēnā ata. Good morning. Welcome to Winning the Green Premium, a webinar series for New Zealand's sustainable food and fibre exporters, brought to you by the Value Project and by NZTE. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you and good morning. Ko Vincent Heeringa. I'm a journalist and a writer, and I'll be your host this morning. And this series that we've been doing, this is the third in the series, attempts to answer a really big question for New Zealand food producers. We know that consumers are demanding ever greater sustainability from their food. They want to know that it's ethically made and environmentally benign, and that's all good, but that comes at a cost. Who's going to pay? And how are producers going to earn more to cover those costs? Well, in this series, we explore how several Kiwi brands are indeed winning the green premium by working with their suppliers and their communities, their retailers and their consumers to find greater value and then reinvest that into sustainable production. The series is rooted in research by Our Land and Water. It's a program called Rewarding Sustainable Practices. And it explored the power of value chains to achieve that kind of ROI. And it continues also New Zealand Trade and Enterprise legacy of working with values-based exporters to get growth for New Zealand's businesses. Well, you can find out more about that research and into value chains at thevalueproject.net. And you'll find videos, case studies, interviews, and a very helpful tool called the Value Chain Compass. So fill your boots. If you're into value, then this is the place for you. Well, on to this episode. This is about finding the green premium in the horticultural sector. And we've assembled a really stellar lineup for you this morning. Dr. Caroline Saunders is the lead researcher at the Agribusiness and Economics Research Unit, which sits within Lincoln University. And this unit really is the author of the research program. So, Caroline, it's a pleasure to have you with us. We're also joined by one of Caroline's colleagues, Dr. John Reid, who's a fellow at the Ngai Tahu Research Centre at Lincoln University. So welcome, John. Carol Ward is the Chief Grower and Industry and Sustainability Officer at Zespri, a familiar face to many of you in the hort sector. And we're really delighted also to have a relatively new face, Morgan Moore, who's the founder of Boring Oat Milk. Anyone that has followed the fortunes of the oat sector, oat milk sector and Boring in particular will know just how pioneering and inspiring you've been, Morgan. So welcome to all of my guests.
Thank you, Vincent.
Well, I'd like to start with you, Caroline. Not just because you're the wisest and the smartest in the room, but that might help. I remember when we first started this whole exercise, you told me a great anecdote about New Zealand lamb. I know this is not a hort story, but it's kind of relevant. You were standing in a Tesco with your colleague Paul Dalzell, and what was it that you discovered when you were standing in front of those racks of lamb?
So thank you, Vincent. Thanks for the introduction. And I might not be the wisest, but I'm the oldest. So thank you for that. That was back in 2010 that I took Paul around the UK, because I'm originally from the UK, to the supermarkets. And it really just broke my heart to see New Zealand lamb at the bottom of the shelf in a sort of frozen pack, unlabelled, at a lowest price compared to lamb in the other segments of the supermarkets. And so with that and previous work that we'd just finished the Food Miles report, that it started a journey on how could we increase the value of New Zealand product in market.
That journey really has defined your career, hasn't it? Well, maybe not entire your career, but a significant chunk of it. And have you discovered or found a way to unlock that value that you think exists in New Zealand primary sector?
Yeah, well, after the Food Miles report, which was a 26, so that was a long, long time ago, that I got very privileged to go around and talk to a lot of the big companies, and their reflection was, Caroline, what you're saying is very UK-centric. China and India don't care how the food's produced. We're a low-cost producer, and we won't, we'll feed protein to China and India. And so we started a journey because I don't think anything from New Zealand should be low cost. It should be high value, high social, high cultural, high environmental, and thus high economic value. So we started a journey then trying the value proposition back to the big sectors, and all the sectors in particular, that China and India actually cared more than the UK, and that there were premiums that were to be made within market from selling on what we call the attributes of the food. So whether it's animal welfare or environmental sustainability, Maori cultural attributes, and these vary by product and market. And we've continued that journey through to this particular project.
Your proposition is that at its very core, New Zealand, even without terribly changing it much, the New Zealand output already is of a high standard, but that standard was not being articulated to the market and not captured in that value chain.
Absolutely. And, I'm not pretending that New Zealand was perfect, and we're asking a lot of our farmers and producers now, but we've got to give them some carrots as well as the sticks. But even before that, there was product going into market, getting a premium for being New Zealand, but it wasn't coming back to New Zealand farmers. It was being captured by others elsewhere. And a lot of product which just wasn't getting a premium at all in market. So my dream was that not an ounce of New Zealand product should be sold at a commodity price. I don't mean it's not a commodity. I mean we get a premium because it comes from New Zealand.
Is that true? Has that journey started, and are you seeing evidence of that premium being captured now?
I'm certainly seeing evidence of that being captured. I'm not pretending it's been taken across all the products, but even Fonterra, they get a premium for their skim milk, their milk powders, which are just still the basic commodity. We've seen certain real exemplars of premiums in some sectors. And Carol, it's just a joy to have you on the webinar, because I've worked with Carol for years, and Zespri have always been like the exemplar, twice the world price for kiwi fruit in the world market, and still being the dominant supplier. You're thinking of horticulture, you're thinking of the wine market too. Again, you think of the premiums that we obtain for our wines in market. These are our real exemplar sectors. And then you're beginning to see it in meat and in some parts of the meat sector. And as I've said, dairy as well. So yes, it's beginning to get changed. And you're less having that conversation, we are low-cost suppliers. I don't hear that so much anymore. I hear
so
more.
there's a mindset changes as well, probably, which is the most important. I mean, it's kind of appropriate, Carol, that you are here, because Caroline is right that Zespri is, in some ways, it's an outlier, isn't it, for having a value chain that has created value and captured value. That value seems to be sustainable. Just describe where you're at the moment in terms of, world prices, what's coming back to growers. Have you been able to maintain that premium, Carol, despite COVID and all the other disruptions we've experienced?
Kia ora, Vincent, and thank you. Great question. So I guess when we look at kiwi fruit, our Zespri kiwi fruit has been able to establish a premium by really focusing in the first instance on the consumer. So it's really about deeply understanding what does the consumer need and how do we present that and provide that to the customer. So it's not a supply-driven production-based view, it's a consumer market-led perspective. So we know through our research that there's a high responsibility around taste and quality. For fruit, people need to know that it's going to taste good, that it's high quality. We've also really understood that being able to communicate the health benefits is critical for us to be able to capture that premium. And what we're finding now is that there's a really strong view that this is not just about the product attributes, this is about the brand, it's about the production system, it's about where the fruit has come from, and what we call sustainability in a very broad sense fruits. People want to know that the fruit has been produced in a way that cares for the environment, that looks after its workers and its welfare, and it's a brand that has purpose. And it's through that wider communication of benefits that we've been able to hold our premium in the market and to capture that value back for New Zealand kiwi fruit producers.
Is that because you're always chasing a premium kind of customer, or has that expectation from what I would have thought was quite a narrow band of customers that would be interested in that stuff? Is that now kind of seeping into the mainstream, and that's how you get market growth, because these things are now being mainstreamed? I don't think that the attraction segment is quite as narrow as what you're portraying, Vincent. We do recognise that kiwi fruit is a premium fruit, so there is it is really the middle income and upper income consumers in many countries that are able to afford a kiwi fruit. But when we're talking about a health benefit with a brand that they trust, then paying $1 or $2 for a kiwi fruit is actually good value when you consider the price of many other healthy products. Excuse me, that is my smoke alarm. There's always something, isn't there?
That got me a little bit distracted there. What was I talking about? I'm sorry.
You were talking about the perception of consumers around what they count as sustainability, what really matters to them. And my sense was that was a really narrow band of consumers. But actually what you're saying is that sort of expectation is really growing.
It is, and I think, you know, if we look here in New Zealand, we've seen the publication of the Kantar report around what really matters to consumers, and we see that the segment called the eco-actives is really increasing, and these are people who not only care about sustainability attributes of their products, but also willing to turn that intent into action. There's always a bit of a drop-off, and cost of living and pricing does play into that. And some of that depends on how critical the consumer thinks this product is for their daily diet or for their living. And with a kiwi fruit, it's quite positive because they may go without a holiday or a car or some new clothes, but actually eating food is something everyone does every day, and we have what we call the lipstick effect, where actually you can treat yourself with something that you do on a daily basis, like putting on lipstick, even if you haven't got the new designer handbag with it. So there is this view of lower cost items can still be part of that purchase basket. But you know, it is tough with that with the cost of living. We are seeing consumers trade down, not only in terms of the volume of what they're buying, but also the price that they're willing to pay.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And what I find so interesting about Zespri is you've captured that consumer insight and you've driven all of that insight back down the value chain, haven't you? Back through your supply chain to make sure there's real alignment with those expectations. Caroline, when you were doing your study of Zespri and others that are successful in that kind of value chain creation, how does that work? Can you unpack that a little bit for us? Maybe start with Caroline and jump in, Carol, if you've got new bits to add.
Well, the bit and sorry, Carol, I might be stealing your thunder here, but the bit that really resonates with me as an exemplar for what we're talking about here is the Taste Zespri program. And what happened, and so as Carol has said, the value chain, you start with the consumer. That's where the value is. And I'm not just talking dollar value, I'm talking environmental, social, cultural value as well, whether it's health or what other attribute. But the fruit into Japan was not selling that well because the sugar content was low and it wasn't as tasty as they liked. So Zespri introduced Taste Zespri. With the consumer research, they discovered what it was. They took that back to producers, which meant producers had to reduce their yield, and they actually pay a premium to producers for that. So the whole chain picked up that that value and meant that that market revived and has flourished. So apologies, Carol, if I stole your thunder, but I still think it's just a brilliant example of what we're talking about here.
There must be a similar kind of, on the converse side, when the PSA disease hit and you had this kind of incredible hit on production, the value chain kind of flexed there too, didn't it? Can you explain, how did Zespri, and not just Zespri, but the whole kind of value chain, how did that respond to such a crisis?
Yeah, so this was a disease that impacted the health of the vine, and it was really through the focus on innovation and science that pulled the industry through. We'd been doing research for a number of years with plant and food research, looking at new cultivars and looking at how we could build the portfolio on that. So there was actually a couple of other cultivars already in that innovation pipeline, which proved that they had some resilience on that. So I think it's, from a New Zealand primary sector perspective, the ability to capture value through innovation, which is deeply grounded on consumer needs and what the market desires, is a really important way to build your resilience. I think as we look now with climate change, we do see that broadening the product portfolio is one way to build our resilience, but there's also other things that growers are doing on the orchard which can build that production resilience around climate change and around these extreme weather events that we're experiencing, and still be able to then deliver a great fruit to market which can capture that price premium.
In a really high functioning value chain, those growers should expect support from the other partners in the chain. Would that be a fair assumption? They're not on their own, are they?
Well, I think it's always, we're part of an ecosystem, and I think when a grower has some level of prosperity and sustainability in their financial returns, it really means that the whole value chain is healthy, and that then enables that reinvestment back into capacity growth, into value capture. One of the challenges that we have, and Caroline mentioned it before, is actually the distance to market. And if we're looking from a sustainability perspective, that does add quite a significant part of emissions to our global footprint, and how we can present our carbon position to our consumers in the market. And this is becoming really important particularly in Europe, increasingly in North America. And I think, will come through time into Asia as well. And as we're seeing the real pressure towards moving towards a decarbonised economy and reducing the carbon emissions from our chain, it becomes more critical than ever to work with those supply chain partners, such as the shipping companies, such as the packaging and pack houses, and with the grower as well on the orchard.
Okay, well, that's such a good point.
Pleased to say though, Vincent, kiwi fruit is a relatively low emission product, and actually a really relatively strong position when we consider through food that's produced and through the primary sector.
Well, in fact, I think the whole plant food sector feels quite optimistic in that regard, given the pressure on us to reduce emissions. So we might come back to some of the advantages that Hort has in that regard if there's time. But thank you, Carol, and for explaining that kind of the way that Zespri operates, because it's such a great example of a value chain at work. Now, Morgan, it feels like you're at the beginning of this journey. You've pioneered the oat milk production in New Zealand. You're the only oat milk that produces in New Zealand. We know that there are other companies that source from New Zealand, but they produce typically in Sweden, right? Which is where oat milk is. I don't know why Sweden has become the home of oat milk, but there you go. But in your case, you've actually pioneered it in New Zealand. So I think we should hear the story from the beginning. Can you tell us, where did the inspiration come from, and what did you do next to make it a reality?
Kia ora, everyone. So I guess to answer the question of why it's all made in Sweden, well, that's actually a company called Oatly, the sort of inventors of oat milk. And so they created oat, and they're based in Sweden. They created oat milk about 25 years ago, and a similar sort of farming landscape to New Zealand, where it's predominantly dairy, and they saw, they also grew oats really well, and so they thought, how about oats being a good plant-based alternative? It didn't actually really sort of come and increase in popularity until about 7 years ago. So they, so lots of the technology and the IP and the knowledge has come from Sweden. But the reason I got into it was I'm from Taranaki, and my auntie has a dairy farm here. And I used to work on the dairy farm as a teenager. And this was quite a while ago, and she would, was sort of ahead of her time in terms of riparian planting, and just always thinking of ways that she could sort of reduce the impact on land, including sort of, spot fertilizing, as opposed to just putting fertilizer across, urea across the whole paddock. And one thing that she did was she planted oats. And I remember I asked her one day why she was doing this, and she said that oats soaked up nitrates or nitrogen. And I thought, God, that's so cool. Maybe not what most typical teenagers think is cool, but just that, here we had oats, that the sort of humble oat that we have in our porridge and have in our cereal, and here it was actually doing good for the soil as well. And then skip forward a few years, and I created a brand using oats, because I thought, well, how about if we just grow more oats? And so I actually was living in Scotland. I moved back to New Zealand. When I was in Scotland, oat cakes, like oat crackers, were really popular. And I thought, well, they should be as popular here as they are over there. And so I started making these oat cakes and selling them at the markets in Parnell, and got bigger and bigger, got into supermarkets, and then, hired more bakers, all that sort of stuff, and just learning about sort of business 101 and supermarket 101, just learning about how consumers work, how their supply chain works. And I realized after a few years, though, that my sort of fancy crackers that people were having on their cheese boards every other Friday night wasn't really going to cut the mustard in terms of volume and scale back on land. And so I thought, this has to be a product that people are consuming every day. And that's when I saw what was happening with oat milk over in Europe. And so it made no sense to me that at that stage, especially all of our plant milks were imported in. And, and I thought, well, we've got lots of stainless steel, we've got lots of UHT manufacturing, so why can't it be made here? And from the idea till we launched was 3 years. And we're still the only one made in New Zealand.
It's such a short journey from gestation to reality. You must have had partners who are, prepared to invest, prepared to share the adventure. Can you tell us about particularly that the apple processor, who I think from memory played quite an important role for you?
Yeah, well, I'd say not at the beginning. Nobody really wanted to be a part of me at the beginning, because I was just this young woman with a crazy idea, and who was I to sort of do this thing and be the one to launch this first product. And so initially I sort of, took all that risk on my own, and managed to get a bit of investment, but, from friends and family and from investors. And it was an incredible amount of stress and pressure. And I just worked with these partners to be essentially just like contract manufacturers or contractors. Mm-hmm. And then as we got further along, and I guess I sort of validated myself and the process and the brand, these partners realized that this was real, and I was serious about this, and this was a good idea. And so, initially I met Apollo Foods, who own the Apple Press, and so they people who are as mad as I am, actually. They started off as orchardists and food technologists, and they had these apples that were sort of like third grade apples, and that they were still really good quality, but they had blemishes on them, your kind of ugly fruit. And they thought, these apples are still really good quality. How about if we juice these apples in a way that was really low impact and bottled them, so it was essentially like drinking an apple juice. And so their real point of difference is that they are really very strong on the varietal piece. So they have Jazz apple and envy apple juice. And I thought, well, they've got the same sort of challenge as me, where they need to get the apples and get it into liquid form to then bottle it. And the same with us with oats. So initially I was speaking to them as just a contract manufacturer. And then it was a few months out from launch, and I was looking for investment, and rather than just sort of doing a typical sort of investor, like kind of startup relationship, we partnered together. And so I joined forces with them, and that was 2 years ago now. And it's just been great. Like it's, kind of, if you look along that whole sort of value chain, and no one part can do it on its own. And by partnering, for me, I'm very much interested in the consumer piece and marketing and sales. And for them, they still had some strength in those places, but it was very much about the manufacturing and the technology and, and all that stuff. And so, so we partnered, and it's really just worked together so well. I think having those aligned values has been critical.
The key insight from the work that Caroline and Paul and Tiffany and John has done is the values that join the partners in the value chain is kind of the key driver of behaviour, of expectations. So it's kind of in some ways really heartening, but not surprising to hear that that's that values agreement that then starts to lead to different, to sort of further behaviours down the line.
Yeah, I mean, it's very cliche, but it is. You just need to find people whose values are aligned with your own, because when push comes to shove and you have to make decisions, financial decisions in a business, with pressing like cost of goods and things like that, if you're not coming from the same place, then you're going to disagree. And so I think because we've got this the same set of values, when we've had these challenges over the last couple of years, like everyone has, we're working on it together, which is really
so interesting. Caroline, this reminds me of Patsy Bass talking of a couple of shows ago, where she from the Reefton Distill Company, the values there around Reefton, isn't it? Around family, around origin, and a kind of a sort of coalescing around this kind of big idea.
I agree that these shared values is what we found across the chain. And you would go and interview different sort of pieces across the value chain, and you'd wait in the waiting room, and their mission statement or their vision statement be on the wall, and they'd almost be identical. And I think one of the key sectors sector is probably the wrong word, is in Maori. They're looking at the values that they have across the value chains is just magic.
Well, speaking of Ngāi Tahu and John, a perfect opportunity, John, to introduce you. Maybe just tell us give us a bit of context for, we're going to be talking about Mia, the perfume, but maybe just give us a bit of context for the Ngāi Tahu Research Centre, and also, your role in this value chain research.
Yeah, the Ngāi Tahu Centre is based at the University of Canterbury. It's focused on mostly economic issues for post-settlement iwi and tribal economic development. Personally, I've worked for Ngāi Tahu for near on 20 years since post-settlement, working on various enterprise type initiatives. In terms of Maya, the perfume, it originates with a traditional perfume that Ngāi Tahu manufactured, and which was called taramia. And taramia is it's known as Spaniard in English. It grows up in the high country, and farmers up there often refer to it as bastard grass, just because it's a spiky plant that's difficult to manage, so it's seen as a weed. However, as you move from west to east across the Alps, as you get further east, it has the scent of the plant gets sweeter and sweeter, and you almost have like a little bit hard to describe. It's got quite smoky types of notes, and a little bit like the smell of the perfume opium, but with these types of notes. Anyway, historically, it was manufactured by Ngai Tahu. It was quite a complicated process to manufacture the perfume, but it was produced down here, and it was produced also in other parts of the country where it grew, but it was traded around the country, particularly by Ngai Tahu. It was sort of a highly prized perfume, somewhat similar to Pounamu or Greenstone, and the way that was traded. Not too many people know about that history. Much of the history was forgotten and lost, and so we began a project back in about 2003 where we started to uncover the lost history and knowledge of Taramia, interviewing elders, but also doing reading up on the old anthropological texts and so forth, until we had sort of nutted out the Taramia formula. But we thought it had a pretty cool story, but also I think primarily for Ngai Tahu it was a cultural revitalisation initiative. It was a way of bringing your culture back to life, a way for your ancestors to speak to you in the present, but also, of course, an incredibly commercial opportunity as well, bringing together the cultural revitalisation with a commercial opportunity to create employment. But also environmentally sustainable one too. Taramia can be harvested in a way that is low impact and sustainable. So it's sort of all lined up. And back then we had French perfume companies wanting to partner with us and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, Ngai Tahu wanted to take a slower route and build it up from the community upward, and which led to the development of the product Mea, which is as basically a perfume oil, which is more of a cottage industry scale initiative, but being sold online and through Ngai Tahu tourism outlets. But since then, we've been investigating how to expand it further internationally and take it into that international perfume market. And not many people know that the perfume market's about the size of the dairy industry internationally, and about $1 billion a year is spent on R&D, which gives rise to about half a dozen perfumes. So per annum that are actually successful. So there's huge opportunity here, particularly around that beautiful storytelling that sits behind it, the perfume of chiefs, but also where that potential might sit for the country and these iconic types of products.
The two ends of this value chain, you've got a large market, the size of the dairy market you're describing, very premium, very sophisticated, high demand. At the other end, you've got a fantastic origin story and a source that you can own. Your job as a researcher was to kind of join those dots, wasn't it? Was to say, well, okay, how does A join to B?
Yeah, that's right. So what we find is, there's different perfume markets out there, of course, but those that there's perfumes that are being that are based on conspicuous consumption. So this is perfumes that are like, I've spent this much on a perfume. These sort of like iconic international type brands. But what's been popping up a bit like craft brewing has been, these boutique perfumes are emerging all around the world. And people are heading toward these craft perfumes with a sort of an indigenous, its own kind of story behind it, its own sort of authentic kind of element to it, where people can find something that resonates with them, but particularly the powerful story that sits behind it. And that's where all the growth has been happening, is in that segment. So it kind of aligns very nicely with an indigenous perfume with an excellent, awesome story sitting behind it, that's about cultural revitalization, empowerment, environmentalism, and so forth. And so then with Caroline's help and her team at the AAU, we started looking at markets in London, New York, San Francisco, and we're trying to peg down, well, who are the people that want to pay the most for this perfume? What are the characteristics of these people? And through that process, we found some very key market segments, which kind of surprised us in terms of the nature of those markets, of who was willing to pay, significant premiums for these products, several $100s a bottle. And so we were quite excited by that research and those discoveries. And from that, we're now looking at how we can market to those market segments, how we build partnership into those international markets, particularly with local perfumers that we can channel those products through. So that's kind of the stage we're at the moment. Just through the awesome work of the AAU.
It's a good example of how, if you start thinking about value chains as a source of business ideas, you call it bastard grass. It's a product that for many people has been a waste product, has been an annoyance, not understanding its actual value culturally, for one thing. But then if you look through a demand lens, you've discovered value that could be created if you structured the journey to market correctly. And there must be other examples of this where we've overlooked opportunities just because we haven't looked through the lens of I suppose, potential for market demand, or you just need a different set of glasses on.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think there's opportunities sitting everywhere. I think one thing that stands out to me is that a lot of particularly the markets we were looking at anyway were younger generations. Younger people, we've found there's a lot of disillusionment with the modern world, so to speak, in a lot of respects. A lot of people feel alienated from place. They're concerned about the future. They're interested in reconnecting with land, with place, with authenticity, with stories of place. There's a big interest in Indigenous modes of thinking, ways of being. And I think this is where, being able to tell the stories of land and of place, which of course Māori have that in spades in terms of being able to express that connection. There's a lot of alienated people and consumers around the world seeking that, looking to connect and to be able to identify back to a place and a story, and to feel good about the way in which they're making their purchases. And so in that way, we're trying to bridge that gap to be able to tell that story and to provide that connection to those into those markets. And like you say, I think, we've looked at many things, particularly based on Indigenous knowledge and traditional Indigenous products. We can see so many opportunities. The question is, how do you activate them? And how do you make them happen? And how do you build up the network of people that share similar values to, I suppose, reach a critical mass to enable that to happen? And I can see Megan being a real entrepreneur there, how she's pulled all of those elements together to make her initiative happen. It sounds like a lot of sweat. Yeah,
it does sound like a lot of hard work. The Taramia story, the Mia story, is on our website, thevalueproject.nz, and so is also John's explanation of South Island Panamu, which went through. We won't have time, John, to go through that, but you took a similar journey with restoring value to Panamu, which had largely been exploited and overlooked and ripped off, but through a really disciplined process added, sort of put Panamu back in a place of high value. That's a really great story, but as I say, we won't go into that now because we don't have time. I should remind everyone that please send in your questions. The questions are coming in. There's a chat function there on the Zoom, so please fire through your questions. I do have a question here for you, Morgan, which is from Anonymous. I was wondering where you source your oat crop from in the South Island, and do you see so it's two questions here. Do you see it as an option for cropping farmers as an alternative to traditional winter grazing?
So we source our oats all from Harraways, actually. So Harraways are the only oat mill in New Zealand, and they have they have about 70 growers that supply into them, and also some consolidators as well. So if you've got sort of a farmer who's growing a few hectares, they then send it through to a consolidator that sends it to Harraways. Absolutely. You've got spring sown oats and autumn sown oats, and there's a lot of data that's came out of the autumn sown oats that it's the yields aren't quite as high, but the benefit on the soil is really good. So definitely as an alternative to winter cropping.
I know you did quite a decent report last year about the potential for oat as a sector. Tell us more about that opportunity.
Yeah, so all the data that we had on growing oats in New Zealand, or growing oats, and the impact of oats was all from overseas, and as well, and the sort of comparison of oat versus dairy, because it's always often seen as a sort of, it's an alternative of. What we wanted to see was we wanted to get that deep knowledge of what it was like to grow, what it did to the soil and the land use to grow oats in New Zealand, and then how that would look if you integrated that into a dairy system. And so we got the guys from Left Field Innovation and Agribusiness to do the report and the work for us, and it showed that oats were 93% less greenhouse gas emissions on farm, like for the on farm activity, greenhouse gas emissions than dairy, and 70% less land use. Sorry, so 93% less greenhouse gas emissions, 70% less land use. But the issue, and how if we were to integrate 10% of oats into a dairy system, what would that do? And obviously it helps decrease all of those things. But the issue is that, oats have half the returns of dairy. And so it kind of goes back to that age-old thing where often those industries that are the most profitable and lucrative are also have the biggest sort of impacts and can be the most damaging onto land. And so we did this report. It's on our website. It's on boringmilk.com. And we just wanted to show those farmers, those dairy farmers who were growing oats, like how much that was helping their land. But in the same breath, we're not saying that this is the sort of silver bullet of alternative cropping, and it's not going to solve all your problems. It's just one of the many tools that you can have. And it sort of comes back to the commercials. And so we just provided the data, and it's really opened up the floor for a much bigger conversation of then, like, how do you stack it up in terms of those commercials? So, yeah.
Carol, you hinted at the demands that climate change are going to put on your growers and on your ecosystem. Do you want to just tell us about some of your thinking about dealing with all the elements that are going to come with climate change?
Yeah, I think responding to a changing climate is one of the most important decisions and topics that any business needs to step into. In kiwifruit industry over the last 12 months, we've been hit by a really significant polar frost. We've had major floods and storm events. We've had the cyclone through on the East Coast as well. So we're seeing firsthand the impact that it has, particularly on this primary production and primary sector. So we've put together we've done a science-based study looking at what the risks are and what those opportunities are. And also we've put together an adaptation plan. Quite pleased, actually. This is one of the first adaptation plans which has come through in the primary sector. So this basically points us in directions of how we might build and through a just transition to support our growers, to support our industry, and looking at initiatives in the short term, but also longer term. And I mentioned before, short term there may be opportunities like protected environments for the orchard, hail netting, irrigation systems, those types of things. Longer term, it may actually be land use decisions that are made, or new cultivars, new varieties that come into play as well. So how do we build our resilience and make sure that we can continue to thrive in the changing climate that we're seeing?
It's such a challenge. I mean, Morgan mentioned before the profitability of dairy partly exists because we're not fully accounting for the externalities of the polluting effects of water, excess fertilizer, and so on. It seems to me that horticulture kind of gets away with it in that it, from a PR point of view, horticulture, correct me if I'm wrong, but horticulture seems to be able to articulate a sustainability story. What are the, is that true, Carol? And what are the challenges that horticulture has as a sector to meet these sustainability expectations around, say, water and land use?
I don't think it's that we get away with it. I actually think that relatively we're a really solid land use option. We're not saying that we're zero emissions, but actually our production practices and the fact that we don't have any methane gas emissions does mean that relatively for every hectare of land, it's high productivity, it's high export earnings, and it's a relatively low environmental impact for our production. So I think we deserve the, that comparison of saying, hey, is there a way from New Zealand's future that we can support the growth in horticulture and also, diversify our export sector, diversify our product portfolio? And sorry, it's just slipped my mind, Vincent. What was the second part of the question?
Well, I suppose the question would be, it's not just emissions that are that we should be concerned about. Water use, for instance, trees are hungry things when it comes to water, and also there's quite a lot of concern about monocrop, and we know that a really efficient vineyard, vineyard, or I'm thinking of avos and other orchards, a really efficient orchard is going to be typically a monocrop, right?
Yeah, you're right. It's not, when we look more broadly at sustainability, it's not just about emissions, and it is about things like water quality. That's really important for us. We're working across the science sector and with our growers to understand the impact of kiwi fruit production on water quality, and in particular understand any nitrate losses that come through from our production systems. So again, we think that in general we're in a strong position, but we know that there's absolutely pockets of behaviours, pockets of soil types or topography, which increase the risk in terms of impact on water quality. So we're stepping really strongly into that with the local councils and with our growers to try and make sure that we can give confidence on our sector's impact on water. With regards to monocrop, I think that's a really important one. If we look at it across New Zealand, we do have quite a reliance on a limited number of crops, but I do think that we need to look at the biodiversity of an orchard system and of a farming system overall. And many of our growers are actually doing riparian planting. They are looking at ways that they can build the biodiversity within their land. And I commend, with the TNFD initiatives coming through, that we need to have a strong look as a country and as a world on what is the biodiversity that we offer and what role can New Zealand play in terms of supporting what we need to do around the challenge of deforestation and increasing the level of biodiversity in our environment. So I think it's a really, really important question, and we're only just starting globally to really step into that conversation.
While we're on, thank you, Carol. Morgan, here's a question for you, and I think it's it's a potentially very technical question. So let's not get too lost in the detail. But it's really a question of asking: did you count the difference between methane and carbon dioxide in your calculations? So methane obviously hugely important in the short term, but in the long term, carbon dioxide is the thing that really matters. And the question here is, when we look at carbon emissions from activities such as harvesting, transport, soil disturbance, are you counting those kind of things in your calculations as well when you make a comparison with dairy?
Yeah, that was included in it as well. So even with all of those things and including the processing, because obviously oat milk's got a lot more processing than what dairy does, it's still, even at the end product, it's still 80% less emissions than what it is in dairy. But just going back to that point that Carol was talking about with the sort of, understanding those true costs, I think it's just so important for us to take a step back and look at that holistic system, because we often can pick and choose whatever suits the product or the crop best and decide to sort of wave that flag of we're good with emissions or we're good with water use. But it's really important when you're looking at those true costs to, what is the impact on soil health, water use, emissions, human health, animal welfare, and look at that holistically, because I think that's the problem. Like, we get so stuck on carbon, for example, and everybody's like really just looking at carbon in isolation. But like we know, like we're trying to simplify an incredibly complex system, which is nature, and that's why we've gotten ourselves in so much trouble.
That's such a good point. There's that terrific cartoon of a guy looking through lenses, and all he can see is carbon. But outside of his focus is a biodiversity crisis and social crises, and we can become myopic, can't we? In our view, There's a lovely question here from Emma Wheeler, and I think probably this is one. Well, it could be for everyone, but I'll start with you, Caroline. Do you think consumers offshore are looking more to locally sourced products for reasons such as shorter supply chains, supporting local communities and so on? And if so, do you think New Zealand will suffer? Is New Zealand able to capture a premium on provenance when we're so far away?
Gosh, that takes me back. So yes, research over COVID did certainly show a strengthening for local products and local ones. And don't get me wrong, I've always supported that people connect with their local producers and farmers, because, back in the day that people don't. I remember a primary school teacher asking the kids to grow in the UK to draw a fish, and they drew a fish finger. So anything that sort of connects consumers with their farmers. But what we showed with the Food Miles report was that food in New Zealand delivered to the UK was better for the environment than food produced in the UK itself, and considerably different. And we looked at particularly at dairy and meat, onions and apples for the horticultural sector as well. So one of the things I do say, which people sort of say, well, you're a bit crazy, is we should really connect with the consumers in those markets and almost market ourselves as local. And that the consumers, as John has said, want to be authentic. They want to connect with where their food is coming from. And so we can respect that, show them where it comes from, show that shipping it across the world is not necessarily worse for the environment than it being produced where it is, and give them that connected story.
That's so interesting. Emma asks, if distance can be overcome, what are the attributes that you need to sell that might overcome that distance concern?
So in our work, we've done a lot of consumer surveys, and they're all on our website, across different products and different markets, and it does vary a little bit. So, and it varies by consumer segment. But in general, we find environmental stewardship, social responsibility or family farms, some of the values that Maori, as John's work, because he's done a lot more work than he's just talked about now, about how different values in market connect with Maori values back in New Zealand. Animal welfare would be another one. Another interesting finding we're seeing is the older generations, and I'm making a generalisation here, generally are happy with made in New Zealand, and that does get a premium. People do connect with a range of attributes with that. But with the younger generation, less so. They want to see more proof or evidence of the actual sustainability credentials of the products themselves.
We got 2 minutes to go. I'm going to throw you a challenge which you may or may not rise to, up to you, but this is for all of you. I wonder if you could just really summarise what gives you a sense of excitement or optimism about the future of hort in New Zealand. What gives you a sense of optimism and excitement about horticulture in New Zealand? And who shall we start with? Well, let's start with Morgan, because I reckon I know what it is, and it might be boring.
What gives me a sense of excitement is just the many people, incredibly smart people, that are just trying to find solutions. And I think in New Zealand, like, we are just a country of innovators and entrepreneurs. And so I feel like every other week I'm introduced or meet somebody who's just coming up with some sort of value add solution to a waste stream or waste stream, quote unquote. And so I think that there's a lot of people with a lot of energy in this country. And so, yeah, we've certainly got the people, and we've got the technology, and we've got the smarts. So, yeah, I think it's kind of te tangata, it comes back to the people.
Great. Carol, how about you?
I'm really excited about the sustainability position that horticulture has. I think that it can play a real role as we look at our food systems, and we look at how we continue to support healthy diets for so many people, not only in New Zealand, where food security is being challenged at the moment, but also through the world as well. So I think that we've got such a great place that we can play.
Thank you. Kia ora. Nice answer. John?
Yeah, I think sort of agreeing with Morgan, I think, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of good ideas, but I think particularly all the solutions are already sitting there, and how we can make a sustainability transition. I think it's just how you enact it. That's the challenge.
Well, last week goes to Caroline Saunders, which is usually the case anyway.
Just fantastic. And I think you're building on a huge history. You've got the history across Zespri and the big apples and pears sectors, showing just how it can be done. And just as Morgan and Carol said, the people out there are amazing and just doing some fantastic things. So keep it on.
Well, kia ora, thank you for those thoughts. It is 10 o'clock. It's time for us to stop yapping and actually do some work. It really has been great fun talking to you all. Thank you. This session is recorded, and so it will be sending it out to everyone on the database. If you if you want to receive a recording, please sign up at thevalueproject.nz. Please do visit thevalueproject.nz. There's some great examples there, all the ones we've mentioned today. And many more, plus that really useful tool for helping you start your journey on creating and discovering and sharing greater value from and for New Zealand. So our thanks to Our Land and Water, to New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. Thanks to Sarah Perriam behind the scenes making these podcasts, these webinars work. Thank you, Sarah and team. And thank you to my guests, Morgan, John, Caroline and Carol. And of course, thank you to you, our guests. Nā reira. I hope you have a great week.